In a system where truth can be twisted, one piece of forgotten footage is about to turn a courtroom and a community upside down. The courtroom fell silent as Officer James Peterson took the stand. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his posture rigid with authority. He had testified in dozens of cases before, but something about today felt different. Marcus Johnson, the defendant, sat quietly at the defense table, his hands folded in front of him. He made eye contact with no one. "Officer Peterson," began District Attorney Reynolds, "please tell the court what happened on the evening of April 7th when you encountered the defendant." Officer Peterson cleared his throat and leaned slightly toward the microphone. "I was on patrol in the West Side neighborhood around 9:30 p.m. We had received multiple reports of break-ins in the area over the previous weeks. I observed Mr. Johnson walking briskly down Maple Street, looking over his shoulder repeatedly." Peterson's voice grew more confident as he continued. "When I activated my lights to stop and question him, Mr. Johnson immediately began running. I pursued him on foot, identifying myself clearly as police and ordering him to stop." The jury listened intently as Peterson described the chase that followed. "When I finally caught up to him in the alley behind the convenience store, he aggressively turned toward me. He reached quickly toward his waistband, which, based on my 15 years of experience, indicated he might be reaching for a weapon." Marcus Johnson slowly shook his head, his face a mask of restrained disbelief. "I drew my service weapon and ordered him to put his hands up," Peterson continued. "He refused multiple commands and continued making threatening movements. It was only after I physically restrained him that I discovered he was unarmed. However, a search of his backpack revealed items matching those reported stolen from a nearby residence." Marcus's attorney rose slowly from her chair. Melissa Taylor had built her reputation defending clients in cases involving police misconduct. She approached the stand with a calm demeanor that contrasted with the tension in the room. "Officer Peterson, thank you for your testimony," she began. "I'd like to clarify a few points. You stated that my client was looking over his shoulder repeatedly before you attempted to stop him. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Peterson replied confidently. "And you interpreted this as suspicious behavior consistent with someone who had committed a crime. Based on my training and experience, yes." Taylor nodded thoughtfully. "You also testified that Mr. Johnson immediately began running when you activated your lights. Is that your testimony?" "Yes, ma'am. He fled as soon as he saw me. And during the subsequent confrontation, you claim my client made threatening movements and reached for his waistband in a manner that made you fear for your safety." "That's exactly what happened," Peterson affirmed, glancing briefly at the jury. Taylor walked back to the defense table, retrieving a tablet. "Your Honor, the defense would like to present Exhibit C, security footage from the convenience store that captured the entire incident." The district attorney immediately objected, but was overruled when Taylor explained that this evidence had only recently been obtained from the store owner, who had initially been reluctant to get involved. The courtroom lights dimmed gradually as the bailiff pulled down the large projection screen. A tense silence fell over the room. Jurors leaned forward in their seats. The prosecutor shuffled papers nervously, and Officer Peterson maintained his stoic expression, though his right hand now gripped the edge of the witness stand a little too tightly. The security footage began to play, the timestamp visible in the corner. 9:32 p.m., April 7th. The camera angle provided an unobstructed view of the alley behind West Side Convenience, illuminated well enough by the store's security lights. There was Marcus Johnson, wearing the same navy jacket mentioned in Peterson's report, walking at an unhurried pace. His shoulders weren't hunched in guilt. His head wasn't swiveling to check for pursuit. Instead, he walked steadily, grocery bags hanging from both hands, occasionally adjusting his grip as the plastic stretched under the weight of his purchases. A collective intake of breath swept through the gallery as Officer Peterson's patrol car appeared at the edge of the frame, lights suddenly flashing to life. The contrast between this reality and Peterson's testimony couldn't have been more stark. Johnson hadn't been running when the officer spotted him. The timestamp showed Peterson had activated his lights the moment he turned into the alley, giving Johnson no chance to flee, even if he'd wanted to. The next moments unfolded with devastating clarity. Peterson emerged from his vehicle with his service weapon already drawn, not after observing threatening movements as he'd testified, but immediately before any interaction had occurred. Johnson's reaction was visible to everyone in the courtroom. Startled surprise followed by immediate compliance. He froze, then slowly raised both hands, the grocery bags still dangling from his fingers. At no point did his hands move toward his waistband. Most damning was what happened next. The footage showed Peterson approaching aggressively, shouting commands that couldn't be heard on the silent video, but were evidenced by his gesturing with his weapon. Johnson knelt as directed, placing his grocery bags carefully on the ground. When Peterson roughly forced him onto his stomach, Johnson's backpack slid off his shoulder. As Peterson handcuffed Johnson, the officer reached into his pocket, withdrew a small object, and slipped it into the side pocket of Johnson's backpack. Judge Coleman's expression hardened as she watched, her years on the bench having trained her to remain impassive. But the slight narrowing of her eyes betrayed her mounting anger. Several jurors exchanged glances of disbelief. One older woman shook her head slightly. In the gallery, Marcus Johnson's mother pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face as she watched her son's humiliation and the officer's betrayal play out on screen. The timestamp continued to run, contradicting every key element of Peterson's testimony: the supposed suspicious behavior, the alleged flight, the claimed threatening movements, and most critically, revealing what appeared to be the deliberate planting of evidence. When the footage finally ended and the lights came back up, the atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed completely. What had begun as a routine case against another young black man had become something far more troubling. A spotlight on abuse of power, captured in undeniable detail. When the lights came back on, the courtroom remained suspended in stunned silence. The air felt charged, as if everyone present was collectively processing the stark contrast between Officer Peterson's sworn testimony and the undeniable visual evidence they had just witnessed. Peterson sat rigid in the witness chair, his formerly confident posture now stiff with tension. A thin sheen of perspiration had formed on his forehead despite the courtroom's cool temperature. Defense attorney Melissa Taylor approached the witness stand with measured steps, maintaining a deliberate calm that only heightened the dramatic tension in the room. She allowed the silence to linger for a moment longer, a tactical pause that forced everyone to sit with what they had just seen. When she finally spoke, her voice was neither accusatory nor triumphant, but clear and unwavering. "Officer Peterson," she began, "would you like to revise your testimony in light of this evidence?" The question hung in the air, offering him a narrow window to acknowledge the discrepancy without explicitly admitting to perjury. Peterson's eyes darted around the courtroom, first to the district attorney, who looked equally blindsided, then to his police sergeant, sitting in the back row, whose expression had hardened into something unreadable. Peterson cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the silent room. "The angle of that camera, it doesn't show everything. There were moments before." His voice trailed off as he attempted to construct an explanation that could reconcile his testimony with the irrefutable footage. His fingers tapped nervously against the wooden railing of the witness stand, each tap echoing slightly in the hushed courtroom. "The timestamp on the video covers the entire period you described in your testimony," Taylor interrupted, her tone sharpening. "At no point did my client run from you. At no point did he reach for his waistband. At no point did he resist your commands." She let each statement land with precision, the repetition hammering home the extent of the discrepancy. "And most importantly, the video clearly shows you placing something in my client's backpack after detaining him. Can you explain that action, Officer Peterson?" District Attorney Reynolds rose quickly from his chair, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Your Honor, the state requests a brief recess to confer with our witness." His voice carried a note of desperation. A prosecutor, suddenly realizing his case, was not only falling apart, but potentially exposing serious misconduct. Judge Coleman's response came swiftly, her gavel remaining untouched on the bench. "Denied," she declared, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. The word landed like a stone in still water. She leaned forward, focusing her full attention on the increasingly uncomfortable officer. "Officer Peterson, you are under oath. I'll ask you directly. Did you provide false testimony to this court today? And did you plant evidence on Mr. Johnson, as the video appears to show?" Peterson's silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was likely only seconds. In that silence, careers hung in the balance, not just his own, but potentially those of supervisors who might have known or encouraged such practices. The gallery remained perfectly still, reporters frantically scribbling notes, Marcus Johnson's family members holding hands tightly in solidarity and disbelief. Finally, Peterson spoke, his voice barely audible. "I'd like to speak with my union representative before answering further questions, Your Honor." It wasn't a confession, but in that courtroom, to everyone present, it might as well have been. The implication was clear. A truthful answer would incriminate him. Judge Coleman's expression darkened further. She turned to address the jury directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will take a 30-minute recess. When we return, I will have some important instructions for you regarding this case." She then fixed her gaze on District Attorney Reynolds. "Counselor, I'll see you and defense counsel in my chambers immediately." As the judge rose, the courtroom erupted into hushed conversations. Officer Peterson remained seated, seemingly unable to move as the reality of his situation began to sink in. Across the room, Marcus Johnson closed his eyes briefly, his expression a complex mixture of vindication and weariness. The face of a man who had just seen confirmed what he had known all along, but had been powerless to prove. 3 weeks after the dramatic courtroom revelation, the warm spring sun bathed the courthouse steps in golden light as Marcus Johnson emerged, flanked by his attorney Melissa Taylor and surrounded by his family. The crowd that had gathered, a mix of reporters, community activists, and ordinary citizens, erupted in applause. Camera flashes created a strobe-like effect as Johnson approached the hastily assembled microphones. Johnson stood tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that his mother had insisted on buying him for this moment. The suit was new, but the weariness in his eyes spoke of an ordeal that had aged him beyond his 35 years. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his tie, and waited for the noise to subside before speaking. His voice, when it came, carried the dignified restraint of a man who had learned to measure every word carefully. "Today isn't just about my vindication," Johnson began, his deep voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. "It's about acknowledging a system that sometimes fails the very people it's meant to protect. I'm grateful for the security footage that told the truth when my word alone wasn't enough." He paused, letting the significance of that statement resonate with the crowd. "But I keep thinking about all the Marcus Johnsons out there who don't have a video to save them." As Johnson spoke, across town in the police department headquarters, a different scene unfolded. Internal Affairs investigators methodically emptied Officer James Peterson's locker, placing his items in cardboard boxes. His badge and service weapon had already been surrendered the day after the court hearing. The department had placed him on administrative leave pending a full investigation, with the district attorney's office actively considering charges for evidence tampering, perjury, and civil rights violations, felonies that could result in significant prison time. Back in the precinct briefing room, other officers watched the coverage of Johnson's press conference on a wall-mounted television. Opinions were divided. Some expressed shock and dismay at Peterson's actions, while others maintained an uneasy silence. The footage exposed not just one officer's misconduct, but raised uncomfortable questions about departmental culture and oversight. Whispered conversations in corners of the room revealed concerns about who else might be implicated as the investigation expanded. At City Hall, the police chief, flanked by the mayor and city council members, called an emergency press conference to announce sweeping changes. The chief, a 30-year veteran who had prided himself on running a clean department, looked visibly shaken as he detailed immediate measures: a department-wide review of arrest procedures, mandatory retraining on constitutional rights, and most significantly, the immediate implementation of body cameras for all officers, a measure that had been repeatedly delayed due to what had been called budget constraints, but now seemed like negligent procrastination. "What happened to Mr. Johnson is unacceptable and contrary to everything we stand for as a police department," the chief declared, his usual confidence replaced by a humbled demeanor. "We have failed not just Mr. Johnson, but the entire community we've sworn to protect. This moment demands more than words. It demands action and accountability at every level." As evening fell, community activists gathered on Maple Street, the very location where Johnson had been wrongfully arrested. What began as a small demonstration swelled to hundreds of people, carrying signs that read, "Justice for Marcus," and "Who watches the watchman?" The crowd was diverse, young and old, representing all races and backgrounds, united by a common concern about equal justice under law. Candles were lit as darkness descended, creating a warm glow that spread down the block. Speakers took turns addressing the crowd, their amplified voices carrying messages not of vengeance but of systemic reform. "Without that footage," noted Reverend Michaels, a respected community leader, "this would be just another case of a black man's word against an officer's. How many Marcus Johnsons don't have video evidence to save them? How many lives and reputations have been destroyed because we as a society decided a badge automatically confers credibility?" In his modest apartment, Marcus Johnson sat at his kitchen table, overwhelmed by the stream of messages on his phone. Friends, family, and even strangers expressing support and solidarity. His case had made national headlines. Footage contradicts officer's testimony, exonerates innocent man. Cable news channels were running specials on police accountability, with legal experts dissecting the implications of his case for police departments nationwide. Johnson's attorney had already filed notice of a civil lawsuit against the department and the city, but for Johnson himself, the fight ahead transcended monetary compensation. He had already accepted invitations to speak at community forums, law schools, and police academy training sessions. His quiet life had been irrevocably altered, but he had resolved to channel his experience into advocacy for transparency in policing and for a system where the truth didn't need to be captured on camera to be believed. As he scrolled through social media, Johnson paused on a post from a mother in another state whose son had experienced a similar situation, but without the benefit of exonerating footage. Her message read simply, "Thank you for standing up. Your voice speaks for my boy, too." Johnson read it twice, then set down his phone and looked out his window at the city lights. The system had nearly crushed him, but in the process, it had given him something unexpected, a platform and a purpose that extended far beyond his case. The aftermath of the courtroom revelation would continue to ripple outward in the weeks and months to come, changing policies, careers, and perceptions. What had begun as one man's nightmare had transformed into a catalyst for change, all because a forgotten security camera had captured what human testimony alone could not convey: the unvarnished truth.